Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm rather unfortunately not able to be with you tonight on this debate on Are We Charlie? Now, I'm really sorry about that because it was sort of my idea that I floated past Matt and thought this would be a really good time to gather together as a community, engage with some of the underlying issues of the entire matter. But it just didn't work out to get the right evening together for me to be there as well with everybody else. So here's my little video contribution. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you, probably about 10 years ago, I wrote a major dissertation for my MA in political philosophy on the issue of censorship, and in particular censorship in the liberal state. And the question being, how can we justify, if we can justify censorship, that is, cutting down the freedom of speech in certain circumstances in a liberal state. And in particular, in my dissertation, I worked on John Stuart Mill and his key book on liberty, which is probably a classical defense of free speech in the liberal state. So I thought probably the best and most concise way would be simply to read to you a few select passages from this dissertation. So hopefully it won't be too thick, but you'll be able to follow along, and that way I can keep it short and straight to the point. So the first bit I'm going to read is just out of chapter 1, and answering the question, why Mill, why the book on liberty, and why censorship. And here, just to generally frame the whole debate on censorship, here's what I wrote. The practice of censorship, as many other practices that call on moral foundations and the limits of the law, stands in need of being justified. It would be simply too easy to state that censorship is always wrong, because all political philosophers, agree that censorship at times is necessary. So the disagreement over censorship, as with many moral issues, is not over the actual practice of censorship, but over how the practice can be justified. Now, depending on the political approach, this is done in a variety of ways. The two main families in the debate are the liberal, two main families of liberal theories, those are the ones we're dealing with, stand out in the debate. The first are what are called right-based theories, and these are, for example, found in Locke, in his letter concerning toleration. And today we find libertarians typically develop this line of thought. The second group, the second family of liberal theories that try to engage with censorship are called consequentialist or utilitarian theories. And John Stuart Mill is one of the prime exponents of this family of theories. So that's just to frame where my particular work was done of these two families, the libertarians on one side, the utilitarians on the other. I'm looking more at the utilitarian approach. So having framed that, here are some of the main problems of censorship that are found in the literature before engaging with what Mill's contribution has been. Now, the main issue of censorship naturally revolves around the question if and when it should be practiced. When do we actually need to cut down on freedom of speech? And this is quite clearly the case with the Are We Charlie debate. Are there cases where free speech needs to be limited, or is can anyone say anything at any time in any way? Now, some claim that the content of speech determines whether it should be censored or not. That is, depending on what is said, then censorship may be applied or not. Others claim that we are not authorized to judge content as liberal citizens, and therefore we must limit ourselves to social consequences. So not so much what is being said, but what are the consequences, the social consequences in particular, of this particular act of speech. Others claim that we must make sure that speech is cost effective, and that the state must compare the eventual damages that can be done by free speech with the loss of liberty and censorship. So here would be the case in the Are We Charlie debate, where the state would have to evaluate the cost effectiveness of allowing this free speech. Is the damage that could be brought by that particular free speech greater than the loss of the free speech through censorship. Now, on the other side, there are those who are prepared to ban state censorship altogether and simply allow society to regulate itself through approval and disapproval. And this is sometimes called the difference between thin and thick censorship. Thin censorship would be censorship that the society engages in. So society will regulate itself and approve or disapprove. So simply people will not buy the magazine if they disapprove. Whereas thick censorship is when the state actually comes in with laws and says, no, you cannot, this act of speech is not permissible. If you do so, there will be punishment and consequences. So then there's a whole other series of issues in censorship that deal with the very nature of speech. What is speech? Is speech only verbal and written? Or can we appropriately speak of speech acts, acts of expression that include acts that communicate in non-verbal ways? So, can these acts be considered on par of speech? So for example, are expressions like pornography or child pornography, are these speech? There's also the issue of the reasonableness of speech. Must speech be reasonable to be really called speech? Is advertisement, for example, to be defended on the same grounds as other forms of speech? So you can see there's a whole Pandora box that opens up with these issues. A third list of problems has to do with the forms of censorship. Are there different forms of censorship? And if so, do different rules apply? What is the difference between state censorship and the censorship by society, which I just mentioned before? How much censorship should be done by the state and how much left to society itself? And do different rules apply to the media, for example, as compared to individuals? There's also a final issue connected to the equality of fair access, and since freedom of speech is not just the act of speaking to oneself, but speaking to an audience, the issue of access and of fair access for many is crucial. For example, John Rawls describes the problem of fair access, indicating that liberty loses value when those with greater means control the public debate. So there's inequalities of access, and that also enters into free speech. Speech isn't really free if some have more access than others. And these inequalities allow the better to get their way and cause the less favored, the better off to get their way, and the less favored withdraw into apathy and resentment. So Rawls would claim that if free speech is to be truly free, it must be equally free to all. So censorship here would have to do with unfair access and redistribution of access. So allowing everyone the same. And of course, internet goes a long way in that direction. So in some of this general topic here, censorship can be a positive force, but also a serious threat. It's been seen as a threat to human autonomy, threat to rational, informed decision making, a threat to democracy. And of course, if it has to do with moral classifications, it's seen as a threat to liberalism. Yet, censorship is called on by all and justified in a variety of ways. Some would claim censorship is appropriate to ban heretical expression. Now, of course, here the whole issue of truth comes into play. And John Stuart Mill writes extensively on truth as well in his book on liberty. Others would would justify censorship to do away with immorality. And of course, again, we're dealing with who's going to set the bar for morality. Some would justify censorship as a necessary social instrument, and others as a tool to protect human rights. And finally, those who justify censorship as a device to contribute to overall human well-being. To human happiness. So we would use censorship means to increase the overall happiness and human being, well-being of a society. And this in particular is where Mill's stance on censorship comes in. So now in the next little bit, we'll actually see some of the things that Mill says, and then I'll read to you a little case study, and that will be the end of what I'd have to share to the debate tonight.